Hey, this is Trent from Marmalade Cream Media. I've got another podcast tip of the week for you. Today, I want to talk about plosives. Plosives. Oh, man. So plosives can be the bane of your existence if you are editing a podcast, an audiobook, any sort of spoken word. And what I mean by plosive is it's when you pop the mic. Now, this particular mic does kind of has some special stuff in it that keeps you from popping the mic too bad. But if you get close up on a microphone, especially a cardioid microphone, and you say the P or B or sometimes even T consonants, you will sometimes get a popping sound. Okay, and it's really annoying and distracting. And if you do it too badly, you end up kind of blowing out the mic just momentarily, and it creates this thing we call a plosive. Now, obviously, if you're in control of this, you can change your mic technique to remove plosives, right? I don't want to go in that today. I want to talk about editing plosives, but just in general, you'll notice how when I talk in the mic, I try to keep the mic off to the side of my face, pointing in towards the center of my mouth. So I'm not dead on. I'm not square up on the on axis on the mic like this, right? It's actually off to the side. And part of that is so when I say a P or a B or T or whatever, whenever I say those consonants, the air is blasting past the mic, not straight into the mic. So all this to say, if you can fix this on the front end, it's well worth the time to learn better mic technique, because that's just going to make things so much easier than trying to edit them all out. But let's talk about what happens if you have a bunch of plosives in your podcast and you need to edit them out. I've got an example right here. Let me play it for you.
Hello, Wineabbers. My name is Jesse Meekum with another episode of the Wineab Podcast.
Okay, you hear it there? There's two clear plosives. There's episode of the Wineab Podcast, right?
Another episode of the Wineab Podcast.
Okay, and you hear that's just that kind of buh, buh. That can be really distracting, especially if someone's listening in headphones and they're hearing a lot of low end because they have got those headphones. Sometimes when you're on speakers, those plosives aren't quite as evident. But if somebody's wearing headphones in particular, they can be really distracting. So how do we deal with them? Well, there's a couple different ways. One thing I'll say is that when you're mixing, right, when you're mixing the voice, if you use a high pass filter and you remove excess low end, then they're going to get better just because you're taking energy away from the excess low end. So in this plug-in chain here, I have a high-pass filter on this voice right up here. This is using an SSL channel strip. I have a high-pass filter set at 120 hertz. Okay, so it's rolling off any frequencies under 120 hertz. So let me show you what happens if I take that off, right? So here it is with all the plug-in processing engaged.
Hello, Wineabbers. My name is Jesse Meekum with another episode of the Wineab Podcast.
Okay, now I'm going to take it out.
Hello, Wineabbers. My name is Jesse Meekum with another episode of the Wineab Podcast.
Right, so you hear there's a lot more low end that comes out. There's a lot more proximity effect from this person working the mic up very close. And if we don't carve that out, all that extra low end energy is really going to make those plosives pop out. So simply high passing is going to clean them up a little bit on its own. But this is going to need a little bit more editing. Now, there's several ways to edit a plosive, and I'll say right away, right off the top of the bat, that you're not always going to be able to edit them cleanly. For various reasons, some of them just don't work out. But I think we can clean these up. You'll notice that most plosives, if you zoom in on the waveform, have like a big dip and a rise to the waveform, right? So you can see how when he's laying into that P sound, just the attack, just the beginning of the P consonant sound here, it's kind of blowing up the mic. It's like the mic is getting this big blast of air, and then it recovers, and the waveform flattens out somewhat, right? But we have this initial blast, and that is what's causing, that's the distracting part of the plosive, right? So what do we do about that? Well, my favorite and most common way that I use to edit plosives is I just try to get rid of the hump, right? If we can just get rid of the hump and make it flatter, a lot of times that will make it less distracting. So what I do is I try to I'm basically just going to cut it out, right? But what I'm looking for is I like to see the part of the waveform that we're going to leave intact right here. I want to see that we'll join up with the waveform on the other end of the edit, right? So if we cut out this highlighted part in the middle here, I'm going to be able, when I crossfade these, to join up this kind of upward rise here on the tail with this downward falling part of the waveform at the beginning of the edit, right? So here's what it looks like. All right, I'm going to cut out this piece. Now, I'm using slip editing or ripple editing. Your DAW might call it different things, but essentially what that means is that when you cut something, instead of leaving it like that where there's a big gap, it's just going to join the two clips together. It's just going to smush them together whenever you make an edit. Okay, so now here's what we've got before the crossfade. We've got a downward slope and we've got an upward rise. Okay, so now we crossfade them and blend them together. Right, now that's going to ensure that there's no clicks and pops that happen at the edit point. It's going to smooth those out, and it's also going to ensure that we're kind of creating an artificial, smoother waveform here, right? So now we've got just kind of a gentle, a flatter fluctuation in the waveform here. So let's see if that worked, right?
Go to the YNAB podcast. Go to the YNAB podcast.
Okay, so it's still, there's a little bit of a puff of air there, but it's a lot less distracting, right? Let's go back without it. Take out all this stuff.
Go to the YNAB podcast. Go to the YNAB podcast.
Yeah, so that's much more noticeable. We take it out, make the crossfade.
Go to the YNAB podcast.
Okay, that's much better. Now you can sit there and if it's really critical, you can sit there and just kind of mess with it, right? Like maybe you can take off a little bit more there, and maybe you can smooth it out here more, and see if that works. But
Go to the YNAB podcast.
Right, that basically is going to take most of the energy out of that blast of air, and it's going to make it less noticeable, right? That's all we're really trying to do with an edit, is we're just trying to make the distracting stuff less noticeable. Okay, now we had another plosive here.
Meekum with another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Episode, right? Episode, that P sound right there, episode.
Another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Right, now that's a quicker one. Sometimes you're going to get plosives that are so quick that if you cut them, like I just did, you might end up making the P sound, you might end up kind of chopping off the P sound, and it can sound stuttery and unnatural. So in this case, there's another way you can handle a plosive with editing, and that's simply by turning it down, right? So here is our little distortion of the waveform that is the P sound, okay? And we see it kind of flattens out. So there's kind of the P that is the plosive, and then there's a sustained P part of the P. So we're just going to highlight this section and cut that, and let's just turn it down. Just use some clip gain, right? I might turn it down 8 decibels, okay? Just kind of arbitrary thing. You're probably not going to notice much change until you turn it down at least 6 decibels, but you can really turn them down quite a bit. So 6, 8, 10 dB, somewhere in that range usually works. Okay, and again, we don't want to create any clicks or pops because we're going from minus 8 dB here back to the normal volume. So I'm going to grab the tail, or I'm going to grab the edge of this clip here, and I'm going to blend it in. I'm going to crossfade it. I'm going to pull it into the part of the clip that we turned down, just to make sure that it's smooth right there. Okay, so let's see if that worked.
With another episode of the YNAB podcast. With another episode of the YNAB.
Okay, yeah, so it just made it less distracting again.
Another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Right, that's kind of distracting. We pull it down 8 dB.
Another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Okay, much better, much better. That's how you can deal with plosives with editing. There's a couple other ways to do it that sometimes work for me, but that's generally 9 times out of 10 how I'm going to approach editing plosives, is simply make a little cut around it, turn it down, or make an edit where you're chopping out the big humpy part in the middle of the plosive. All right, so there's one other thing I want to say, and that's that you can use, if you have access to them, or if you do this a lot, you might want to use a tool that does de-plosiving for you automatically. And I actually have one of those tools here. This is Isotope RX. I have an older package. This is RX7. I think they're on RX10 or something now. They have a module in there called de-plosive, and it does what it says. It's basically this automatic detector circuit that reads that incoming blast of air, and it just turns it down really fast. And it can soften up quite a few plosives. So let's see, I have it disabled right now. So let's listen to the passage without the de-plosive module, and let's turn it back, and then just turn it on and see what it sounds like.
Hello, YNABers. My name is Jesse Meekum with another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Okay, and let's turn it on the de-plosive.
Hello, YNABers. My name is Jesse Meekum with another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Okay, so it softened those up quite a bit, right?
Another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Without
Another episode of the YNAB podcast.
Yeah, so it did a lot to soften those up. Now, I might still personally, I would still want to edit this plosive because it's still a little distracting to me, but I could let it go. And certainly this one here, I wouldn't touch it. Right, this smaller plosive there, I wouldn't touch it. I would just let the de-plosive module do its thing. So those can be a real time saver if you find yourself doing this a lot, and if you're not in control of your mic technique, like we talked about earlier. So anyway, there you go. There's a couple ways to edit plosives, and also to use EQ to manage the low end to kind of take some of the energy out of them. And if you've got access to it, some sort of de-plosive tool that can automatically do this for you can help a lot too. All right. Hope you enjoyed that. Catch you next week.